Geddy is a nice t-shirt.
Oh, thank you.
It's about fishing, right?
Yeah, it's about fish. The big, beautiful book of fish.
So, you spent some time reeling in these instruments, and you could have sat on your goodies like a dragon sits on his treasure in a cave, kept them all to yourself. But you decided to go for a book. Why?
Okay, that's kind of a complicated answer, but I'll do my best. So, as I started getting involved in sort of looking into the instrument that I held in my hands for over 40 years, I realized I knew so little about its origin and so little about its evolution. And in the researching of this stuff, things were turning up. Bits of historical information, personal stories from guys that, slaved away their whole lives in bars playing these wonderful instruments. Obviously famous guys use these instruments, but the weekend warriors also, showed their passion using these instruments. So in the course of collecting the instruments, I was collecting stories. I was collecting stories about human beings, about experience, and about manufacturing these instruments that were so interesting to me. So I would look for other books to get information from and realize there weren't any. I mean, there wasn't a book, a compendium, a proper compendium that showed off my instrument, my electric bass that I spent my life playing. So I felt this has to be corrected. So I set out to do justice to the instrument that brought me my entire life.
I remember also, as your collection got bigger and bigger, the question came up, where are you going to put all these things? And there's this stand-up comic, right? Stephen Wright, he goes, you gotta have everything. Where would you put it? So we decided to put it in a book.
Put it in a book, yeah. No, exactly. It just seemed to me that the more I got to know these instruments, the more I realized how beautiful they can be, that they really are pieces of mid-century art. And they deserve to be photographed well, they deserve to be shared with other lovers of these things. And also the story that was starting to develop to me, the story of the electric bass, is really the story of popular music. So it's a different kind of history of popular music in my view.
Because you're a mad collector, and in the book you kind of describe about how you go down rabbit holes in your obsessions. But you're not just a greedy collector. You once said to me, you collect baseball memorabilia, for example, and you say, well, it gives me a window on American history, or Canadian for that matter. But how does that apply to the bass? Is it the same principle for you?
Yeah, all the things I collect, they grab my imagination because they are windows into the past. When I started getting involved with my love of wine, it brought me to the places that produced wine. And so I was spending a lot of time in France and in Italy and other places of the world. And so it became a window and a doorway to new culture. And I found that as I was reading about electric basses, I was discovering a lot about how mass production got started in California in the 50s and how that in some parts of Italy they were making brilliantly eccentric instruments in the late 50s and 60s. Who knew? I didn't know that.
Partly with accordion parts.
Yeah, exactly. Sweden was making interesting instruments in the 50s and 60s. So the world was expanding to me, and they all connected to my instrument. So I felt that this was the right road for me to go down. It was really the first thing I've ever collected that made sense, to the way I lived my life.
One thing occurred to me recently, which is, you got a big fat book about basses here, but why are basses, first of all, invented so late? Like, people were tinkering around with microphones in the early 20th century, sticking them on trumpets and violins, and no bass, no electric bass until early 1950s. What was the genius that went into making the bass? Why is that an important step? Why did it take so long?
I don't know why it took so long, but I know that, imagine being in a band traveling around, parts of the world, and you're the bass player. Well, they're traveling around in some sort of bus or small van or car with a trailer on it, and the stand-up bass doesn't fit. So it would be relegated to the roof, So when people started tinkering with electronics, I can imagine the relief that the bass player had when he finally realized, oh my God, I can actually, travel with this thing and play in tune because it has frets, So I think it was such an important discovery when it did finally come along, but I don't know why it took so long.
There's also a bit of a chicken and egg thing because there were not strings for electric basses when Leo Fender started rolling out who was going to make the strings? So he used piano wire.
That's right, piano wire.
So everything had to be developed from scratch. It's kind of incredible. But we take that for granted, don't we, today?
Well, I certainly did. I played the instrument for years without realizing where it started, but it was a wonderful journey for me to discover all these things.
How much of the book is personal to you? How much is historical and technical?
Well, as you know, when we sat down to write the book, I didn't want it to be a dry encyclopedia. I didn't want it to be a reference book in that way. I wanted it to be conversational, like we're talking right now, Like I wanted it to be friendly, and I wanted people to be able to just look at the pictures if that's all they want. Some of the photography is stunning, and I don't think instruments have ever been photographed so beautifully. So there was no prerequisite that you have to know the history of Gibson, or you have to know who was Dan Electro, who made Dan Electro. So I wanted those things to be secondary to the beauty of the book. And I would like to have had a few more pages, but I had to satisfy with 408.
Only 409. But I remember when we were starting laying out the technical details, we had what you called nerd bubbles, right? And nerd bubbles were the sidebars where if you were that way inclined, you could dig deeper into the nuts and bolts of the business. But much of the book is actually your sort of anecdotal and emotional, isn't it?
Well, I think it's interesting to talk about these books these instruments from the perspective of having played them as well. They're not just objects that live in isolation. They make music and they make people happy, and people have spent their lives using them. And I think that's what's the great thing about it. So I made sure that I talked to a lot of different players, and we interviewed a number of people, as you know, and the reason to interview them was to bring the instruments to life, to remind people that these aren't just pieces of wood and steel and plastic. These are things that come alive in the hands of anyone that feels the passion to play them.
I've known you for a little bit longer than the time it took to write this book, and one thing that always impressed me about you was that you really never talked about your work. You didn't talk about instruments as if they were some sort of object of fetish, or you didn't carry on and on about it. They were tools of the trade for you, like a hoe. Did you find it difficult to analyze the instruments in the detail that the book required, and would that sort of risk ruining it for you?
Well, I always used instruments only that were helped me develop my sound. I wasn't a collector of instruments in the past. I only went to the instruments I felt would aid in expressing my musical vision and establishing my own musical identity. So yes, they were tools, only tools to me. So when I started the idea of collecting older basses and vintage basses, it was a bit foreign to me. I didn't see how I could possibly use them, especially in the context of Rush. But a funny thing happens when you fall in love with a history and you start going down that rabbit hole. You find that you want to share your excitement. I was learning so many things. Some of them were very nerdy things, and some of them were quite fascinating. And I thought, Well, I want to tell people about this, you know. I love to converse about the things I'm passionate about, so the book seemed a natural way of doing that. But these instruments, they tell so many stories, and those stories need to be shared, I think.
Give us an example of something really nerdy.
Well, there's endless amount of nerdiness in this book. I mean, if you like knobs, we talk about knobs.
Woo! Knobs!
When did they go from being rounded to being flat on the top? I mean, that's about as nerdy as you get.
Well, I remember the day we actually took out a measuring tape, right? And we went down to the basement.
Yeah, we
measured the circumference.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of help.
Don't tell them that.
You had a lot of help, it should be said, from your bass tech of many years, Scully McIntosh.
Yeah, my bass tech, Scully, he's really the curator of the collection, and he's the defender of the instrument. So whenever we get talking about this and that and the other, and he would always say, no, that's not what's important. This is what's important. So he's the conscience of the book in many respects. Yeah.
Even though you concentrated on several key instruments in the course of Rush, did you not look at other players and say, that looks cool in his hands? I mean, when I think of Rickenbackers, I don't just think of you playing them, I think Lemmy and Hawkwind, for example, and they're iconic shape, they're like super cool forever. But mainly because they're amplified, the cool is amplified by who played them. Did you have that feeling, any yearning at all to pick up an instrument that was played by a player you admired?
Well, and of course, you know, you always wonder what Jack Bruce's EB3 would have felt like to play, or you know, I had the good fortune of playing John Entwistle's Frankenstein when I visited its residence in California. But yeah, of course, those instruments represent some sort of magic. When we were doing the interview with John Paul Jones, as you recall, he came to my apartment in London, and we did this wonderful afternoon with him. And I have to tell you, John Paul Jones may be the nicest guy in the music business. I mean, he's an incredible gentleman. We had met before because we had talked at one point about using him to do some string arrangements for Rush, but the timing never worked out. So it was sort of a bit of a reunion when he came over to do this interview, but he brought his famous 62 jazz bass, the one that all the early Zeppelin records, and so it was in the room, and I was very aware that it was. And there's this great moment when Daniel and I were setting up for a photograph, and Richard's setting up the lights, and he's just sitting on the couch, just playing Heartbreaker. And Daniel and I are sitting there going, he's playing Heartbreaker. So then it was a time for a photo of the two of us together, and he also had his very first bass that he ever bought. And I said, well, I think you should hold the first bass you ever had, because I can hold the Heartbreaker bass. But it was electric, you know, because there's the man, there's the instrument that made all those records that really changed my life in so many ways.
You spoke to him, you spoke to Bill Wyman from the Stones, and a whole bunch of other players. And one of the things you did was ask them about their early days, their earliest inspiration, the first time they ever heard bass, that sort of thing. Were there any revelations for you, any special, unexpected answers that any of them gave you, or especially illuminating that about, you know, their introduction to bass, their big inspiration that somehow you shared or was surprised by?
Well, I found all their stories so fascinating. Talking to Bill Wyman was such a treat because, for many reasons. Because first of all, he's such an interesting human being. My God, he's written 9 books. He's an amateur archaeologist. He's invented his own metal detector, all because he has very small hands. You see, and so every time I wanted to talk about basses with him, he would change the subject. It's like, dude, we're here to talk about basses, but he wanted to talk about everything else. You know, sports. You know, he's the only musician to ever throw a hat trick at the Oval in cricket. He has to tell you all these things, but what I especially loved was, when I asked him how he got introduced to the bass and how he first thought of himself as a musician, he painted this wonderful picture about, it was like post-war, and his sister would go to these USO dances, and while she was dancing with these American soldiers, he would be sitting in the corner listening to these bands playing and just admiring them and taking the sound in. And I thought that was so evocative. And every musician I talked to had their version of that. And I thought that was really quite fascinating and lovely.
Yeah, I remember John Paul Jones talked about walking along the pier, one of those sort of funfair piers that England specialises in, Blackpool and places like that. And he heard the boom, boom, boom bass coming out of some loudspeaker, and he knew it was for him.
Yeah, that's a great story.
It's so evocative.
I love the quote. What was the quote? He gave us a quote that his father said when he said to his father. Now he came from a family of musicians. His father was a keyboard player. His mother was a singer, I believe. And so he told his dad he wanted to play the bass. And there's this marvelous quote where he said, "Now I wouldn't play that instrument. It's just a novelty. It will pass."
And what about you? When did you first get the bug? Were you born with a bass in your hands?
No, I wasn't born with a bass in my hand. I played in a little garage band. Before we were able to find a garage. We were like sort of a bedroom band. And we had a little guy who was a bass player. And then his mother said, "He can't hang around with us because we're a bad influence." So we had no bass player. And the other two people in the band turned to me and said, "Well, now you're the bass player, I said, "Okay." It's sort of like, nobody wants to be a goalie. They all want to score the goal. And the bass player in those days was a little bit like that. So.
But when did you first hear bass?
I first heard bass on my way to work with my mother. I used to work in her variety store every Saturday, and we would drive for an hour into the small town of Newmarket where her store was. And on the radio was on constantly. And so you'd be drumming on the dashboard and listening to mostly Motown back then. So you were listening, without knowing who it was, I was listening to James Jamerson play and Carol Kay and all these great Motown and session people and all these great moving bass lines, and it sort of sunk into my subconscious, I think.
When we were doing research, I discovered that a lot of sports teams, when they're in the dressing room before they go out to play, put on headphones and they listen to bass-heavy rap because the bass is supposed to stimulate masculine feelings. What is it, in your opinion, in your experience? There you go. In a nutshell, can you say what bass does? And do all basses do the job equally well?
That's a hard question to answer, but to me the bass is the glue. It's the glue of the rhythm section. It ties together what the rhythm of the song is and what the guitar is doing and what the vocal is doing. It's helping the song move in a seamless way. If you take the bass out of the song, you've got a great drum track, you've got a great rhythm guitar track, but there's some glue missing that brings them together. It plays that essential role in my view.
And when you were starting out in Rush, what role for the bass did you imagine that would be different from the role played by your heroes like Jack Bruce and
Well, Jack Bruce was a huge influence to me for Rush because that was a three-piece band and I was in a three-piece band. And so I tried to emulate that whole busyness of Jack Bruce. That's why I became a player that plays too many notes. Because, when it was time for Alex to take a solo, I had to get busy to keep it from sounding empty, so it still sounded like there was a guitar playing in the background. And I think that was a big part of how I developed my sound, to have not only bottom end, but almost a guitar-like edge to it, so that when Alex soloed, it the sound spectrum was still full. So that's sort of what the direction I went, and that was inspired directly from listening to the Cream over and over and over again.
Speaking of Alex, when we were starting out writing the book, I did a bit of backgrounder, and I wanted to talk to him one afternoon to try to get some insight into how you approach music. And he goes, well, you know, you've got the kerrang with the guitar, and then the drums go ch-ch-ch-ch-ch, and then so the Geddy goes woomba woomba. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be difficult.
That sounds like Alex.
Except that I soon discovered musicians don't talk with like huge vocabularies about, you know, that you soon told me.
What do you infer?
Well, like you would say, I would say to you, well, how does this 52 Fender sound? You said, well, it sounds great. Okay, and how about the 53? Well, it sounds great. Did you actually find it difficult to find a new vocabulary? Because musicians don't talk to each other with words, they talk to each other with music.
Yeah, it was hard, and you know that because you kept making me use new words every time. You wouldn't let me use the words great or beautiful.
Until we use the other words.
Yeah. So we had to keep trying to find a way of expressing the tonality of an instrument in a way that sounded fresh every time, because some basses do sound like other basses, and their nuances are what makes them different, or the feel is what makes them different, or the sheer beauty of the instrument is what makes it different. So that was a challenge, but it was a good challenge because it helped me really think about the sound that's coming from each bass as an individual, you know, bit of personality.
You actually went out on tour with 27 of the basses that are in this book, which is kind of incredible. What did you find out about the personalities of some? Do you remember any particular ones that you wish you had played earlier in your career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of people, when they start collecting vintage instruments, are afraid to play them. You know, they want to put them behind glass and just admire them. And I thought, well, these are instruments that need to come to life. They need to be used. So I took them on the road, and it became Scully's responsibility to make sure I had a different one in my hand for every song, which was a challenge. But I learned a lot about myself. You know, I used to think when I was starting that unless I had this bass with this amp and this particular tone, then it wouldn't sound like me. So when I started adding Gibsons and different kinds of Rickenbackers and Zemaitis basses, it sounded like me every time. So it was confirmation that this is where your sound comes from, really. It's not just the instrument, it's your personality as a player that makes it shine. But some of them, like the Gibson Thunderbird, I used to always make fun of other bass players that played Thunderbirds because they're such unwieldy things. You know, they have these really long necks. And particularly, one fellow I toured with a lot was this guy named Pete Way, who played in a band called UFO. And you know, I asked him one time, I said, why do you use that Thunderbird? And I said, how do you describe its sound? He said, well, Glee, he used to call me Glee. Well, Glee, you see, my sound is sort of 3/4 good and 1/4 not very nice. I said, oh, okay, that's what you're after then. So I had this, you know, bias against these basses for years and years and years. And then when I actually started playing them at home, I was surprised that the tonality was not as dark and deep and woolly as I expected it to be. So I took two of them out on the last Rush tour, and actually I found that their tonality, even though it wasn't classic, you know, twang that I look for, they had this fantastic mid-range and this bottom end, and I could turn it up louder than normal. And loud is good for me. I like it when it's loud. So they actually, I learned a lot about, you know, how useful they can be even in the context of Rush.
To quote Motorhead, everything louder than everything else.
Yes.
Very important. Sometimes I wondered when we were making this book how relevant it might be. It's an analog book in a digital age. And if you've ever taken an Uber and listened to what's on the radio, you don't hear the music played on these instruments anymore, it seems. How did you think this book would feature, as they say, an analog thing in a digital world?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't really bothered about the reaction to it. I just felt that I needed to do this and I needed to share what I had discovered. And I thought there are other people out there that love instruments, they love guitars, and they love objet. I mean, these are beautiful examples of mid-century art. They really are. And it's a time that has come and gone. And now you can get any range of bass that have, combine modern technology with them, and of course there's development and it's really going to a cool technological place. But these things represent a time and represent a period of music that I think I can really relate to, and I think many other people relate to it, and I think that's why people have sort of been drawn to this strange big book of bass.
And a similar question, which is, you've got the internet these days. You can look up anything you like on the internet, on the worldwide interweb. What would a book add that the internet can't already offer?
First of all, it's like to me, this is the exact shape of an album, a vinyl album that I grew up on. I loved holding albums in my hand. I don't know, many of you probably enjoy the same experience. So, to me, listening to a record while you're holding that album and you're looking at the lyrics and you're imagining what the writer intended, I think you get the same thing out of this big beast. The pages are beautiful and there's stories there if you want to read them. If you don't, you don't have to, but it's just something that you can indulge yourself in, so I'm really quite proud of it. I'm sorry?
Thanks a lot. Merci beaucoup.
Oh, merci. Brilliant.
Also, as we found out, there's a lot of bullshit on the internet. A lot of conflicting stories and a lot of made-up stuff.
Really?
Yeah. And we spent a lot of time trying to find out the truth.
I thought everything on the internet was true. Now, we put a lot of heart into this. My photographer, Richard Sibbald, was amazing. He shot over 30,000 photographs for this book, and it took us weeks, and I mean months, to edit it down. And I remember when we first delivered it, as you recall, to our editor, she said 3 things to me. She said, well, first of all, I've never received a manuscript that was 845 pages thick. Secondly, I'm so happy to see that your passion for the instrument has come across on the page. And thirdly, which is my favorite part, she said, it's funny. I didn't expect to be laughing. So all the things that I hoped one would get out of a Rush concert back in our heyday, passion, technological stuff, and a cheeky smile. Those are the things I wanted to come across in this book, and I'm very happy if people get that. It's lovely.
That's all I got. Now it's your turn. Anybody got any questions? How is this going to work? Is there somebody